Well, I want to first just say publicly that there are very, very few men in the world that I hold in higher esteem as a friend, as a colleague, as an improvisational, green-hearted compost expert. Meaning that regeneration, taking what is not working, what is breaking down, nourishment for the system, and then in that process being really clear about the whole process of cultural evolution. Evolution not just as individuals, evolution as populations, evolution as communities, and evolution of groups, and how to do that skillfully. So at any rate, so I'm looking as much to learning tonight as sharing. And we're just going to go with the flow. So that's all I want to say for the moment. And then what we'll each probably do, we'll see, is speak about 10 minutes about what we're particularly passionate about related to this topic of regenerative wisdom for challenging times. And then just riff and see where spirit, life, the universe, reality takes us.
Yeah, and I just want to say that I am like a Missouri farm boy who grew up on a chicken farm, and in my childhood years never thought I'd fly on an airplane, and then have somehow found my way into opportunities to travel to different parts of the world and see the earth and bear witness to the hospicing that is occurring. And I cannot say, I just can't say how excited I am to get to have a moment of solemn joy with someone who has so beautifully wrapped grief in a handkerchief of happy tears. I mean, it's just beautiful to be with you, my friend. So I think we're going to have a lot of fun tonight, even though we're going to deal with some serious issues.
So I think what I'd like to do first is just to get a sense of where you are on what Connie sometimes called the doom scale, but where you are sort of on a wide spectrum related to our times and what seems to be unfolding. So I'm curious, how many of you wouldn't be embarrassed to say that you genuinely think that, yeah, we got big problems, huge problems, some of them, but nothing that human ingenuity and technology in the market can't handle? How many of you would sort of feel fairly comfortable with that sort of language? Okay, great. I'm curious, how many of you wouldn't at all be surprised if humanity goes extinct in the next 200 years? Okay. One of the things that kind of exercise has done in my experience most recently, Connie and I were recently in Eastern Canada, and we led a clergy retreat for about 45, 50 ministers. And at the end of the retreat, Connie was responding in an email to somebody who's writing a book on the assisting of trees in migrating north. Because it turns out hundreds of species of trees will go extinct unless humans assist them in migrating faster than any other animal can move them. So it's one of the most holy, sacred tasks that human beings can engage in, because even if we go extinct in the next 100 to 200 years, we can actually be of life-giving assistance to dozens, possibly hundreds, possibly thousands of species of plants. So, and they've been doing that north and south for millions of years. So Connie responded in an email to this guy and said that, yeah, Michael and I just did this clergy retreat, and you know, we gave these ministers a lot of doom, but there's only so much doom you can give ministers before they have to go to their congregations and share stuff. So she said pretty quickly, we got to a post-doom place. And you know something? Post-doom has a gorgeous sunrise. Period. End of email. And she reads this aloud to me, and I'm like, post-doom? First of all, I never heard that. And then post-doom has a gorgeous sunrise? That's kick butt. That's great. So the next day we had lunch and spent the better part of the day with two amazing colleagues, Paul Beckwith, who does these videos on the Arctic and abrupt climate change. Very educational, all of them 15 minutes long. And then Paul Chaferka, who has a blog called Approaching the Limits, And he wrote extensively for about 7 years and then stopped writing because he realized he wasn't going to make a big enough difference. But two of them are two of the amazing elders in this movement of sort of collapse and climate and yet how to stay in a heartful, generous, compassionate place with regard to that. So we bounced the idea of a post-Doom conversation series with them. And they were like, wow, that sounds great. And so Joe and I, about 3 weeks ago, had our post-Doom conversation. I had a post-Doom conversation with Joanna Macy just on Thursday, as I mentioned during the church service today. And how to hold our scary times, how to hold contracting, collapsing times, how to be present to the feelings that arise from that, how to support ourselves and our spouses and our children and our friends and neighbors in moving through whatever grief, whatever anguish, whatever despair, whatever anger, whatever happens to be there. And then ultimately to move through that, allow yourself through the door of despair, or the post-doom door, to the place of expanding circles of gratitude. It's a whole, it seems to me that doom is the midpoint between denial and regeneration. With or without us. Life will regenerate. Earth will regenerate. Gaia will regenerate. That's what reality is about the process of regeneration. So with or without us, that's going to happen. And doom is the midpoint. The problem is most of us think doom is the end. There's nothing after it but lifelong despair. And so we avoid the post-doom door because we're terrified of that. And we know we've got kids or grandkids, we've got lives to live, we've got careers or whatever, and we can't be paralyzed with just like despair. And so we avoid that. And yet the paradox, and this is why Joanna Macy's work is so vital, is that when we honor our grief, when we allow ourselves to share with others our fear, our anguish, our anger, we find that our hearts do break, but they break open with compassion because they remind us of how profoundly interrelated and interconnected we are with all of life. And then we realize that on that door, that midpoint door that we avoided because it said WASF above it. And of course we knew that we are so. So we avoided that door. But when we allow ourselves to go through that door and open up to spheres of conscious gratitude and amazement, and then we look back and that door still says WASF, but we now feel in our soul we are so fortunate to be alive at this time, to be conscious at this time, to be able to grieve for other species, to be able to grieve for our children and grandchildren and theirs if we're so lucky, to be able to grieve for the decline and yet nonetheless be engaged in regenerative work. In whatever spheres and scales we can do that. And that is such holy work and it's such amazing time. And we know from human history that in times of chaos and breakdown and devastation and collapse, 20% of the worst of humanity tends to show up. But 80% of the best of humanity tends to show up. Compassion, generosity, self-sacrifice, engagement that doesn't happen when we're in abundant, wealthy times. So I'm ultimately hopeful, but that hopefulness is in life, is in evolution, is in ecology, is in the way things are, and always have been. Because one of the things we learn, and it gives me inspiration, is that it's not all about me, it's not all about us, it's not all about humans. Humans have an incredible role in the body of life, but we're not what it's all about. And if anything, as my sermon this morning, I went into a little bit more. Humility, growing in humility, a humble relationship to reality is the most soul-nourishing way to live that I can think of. So, anyway, so in this conversation, I just invite you to allow yourself to not be terrified by the post-doom door, because I want everybody in this room to have the experience of we are so fortunate. And then to be able to be a blessing to those in your family that are freaking out or terrified or pissed off at the other political party or whatever.
So I want to start by defining a word, because this word is going to become so important to the rest of your life. And I think you used it about 20 times. So the word regeneration. I really want to get clear on what this means, because we've had about 30 years of the word sustainability, and that word has managed to be very carefully and consciously confused, conflated, made shallow. George Bush Sr. said we're going to sustain our way of life, so you can't take the oil in our SUVs away in 1991 during the Gulf War. The word sustainable has captured our discourse the way a sleight of hand magician redirects our attention away from where the trick is being played. So I want to define the word regeneration as a way to begin, because regeneration has a very important meaning in the study of living systems. Now there's a technical word for this created by two Chilean scientists, philosophers, scholars, Francisco Varela and Humberto Maturana. They came up with this beautiful word, autopoiesis. Who here has heard of autopoiesis? Not bad. So as you know, autopoiesis, those of you who've heard the word, auto means self. Poiesis is the same word that we get the word poetry, to express. Autopoiesis is to create the conditions of one's own expression. So what this word is used to describe is the dynamic pattern of any living thing. A living thing reproduces the conditions, moment to moment, of being alive, of expressing its aliveness. So the paramecium that is navigating through a pool of water, following a gradient of chemicals toward its food supply, moment to moment is regenerating, reproducing, re-expressing the conditions of being alive. Regeneration is every way that autopoiesis occurs. So autopoiesis is something that will actually be very familiar to you. Regeneration is also familiar to you. When I was in elementary school, I learned this really cool fact, that all the skin that you see on my body is dead. Because the subcutaneous tissue under the surface of the skin, where all the blood supply is growing upward to produce an outer layer of skin that dies and flakes off and falls away. And every 30 days, my body completely replaces all of the skin. Every single cell is replaced every 30 days. Meaning that there's a 30-day cycle of regenerating the most important membrane on my body. Regeneration is a moment-to-moment, continual, dynamic process that reproduces the conditions of being alive. The longest form of regeneration that we know goes back about 3.8 billion years to the earliest evidence of life on this planet. We have not yet found evidence of life on other planets. Astrobiologists tell us the chances are really good that we'll find bacteria. We might find eukaryotic cells, and we're very unlikely to find multicellular organisms. But they might be there. If we find them, they will demonstrate autopoiesis as well. So this word regeneration has an interesting feature to it. Regeneration is a dynamic process that is able to close all of its loops back to itself while never, ever achieving balance. It's always out of balance. It's always seeking balance by reproducing the conditions of being alive. Now, what do you think it's going to feel like to go through the collapse of the biosphere of the Earth? It's going to be continually seeking balance and never finding it, while continually trying to find the resources to keep the game going. What's interesting about regeneration is that sustainability is a byproduct. I have homeostasis right now. My body maintains an internal temperature and pressure and salinity, pH level. amount of nutrients for every cell, estimated at 37 trillion cells in my body, maintaining this equilibrium, this dynamic pattern of homeostasis, because regeneration is what I am, and it's just happening. And I am sustaining my aliveness because of so many complex, interconnected patterns of regeneration in my body. I wanted to start here because when we talk about planetary scale collapse, when we talk about mass extinctions, the possible extinction of humans, when we talk about permaculture, regenerative design, what we're talking about is the enactment of what living systems do, with intentionality, conscious planning, management, intervention, and improvisation. You don't know what's going to happen next in living systems. That's the beauty of living systems. And so, as we have this dialogue tonight about what to do in this moment in time, when a destabilization of the regenerative process for the planet, what James Lovelock called the Gaia theory, and respectable scientists thought that was way too religious, so they called it Earth System Science. I studied Earth System Science in graduate school as an atmospheric physicist. Earth System Science is the study of regeneration at planetary scales. So I want to give a quick example of how regeneration happens at planetary scales. The way that the Earth manages to have homeostasis for the climate system is it produces more continents. We have more land mass accumulating as time goes on, which creates a cycle in plate tectonics of pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, and the runoff of our rivers pulling sediments down to the ocean floor, and there's this huge carbon cycle that happens. Lots of interacting parts. What's amazing about the word carbon cycle is that it hides the fact that every living thing on Earth is part of it, because all living things are carbon-based on this planet. So what's amazing is that the ability of the Earth to use plate tectonics, which is the formation of mountains, the movement of fault lines, volcanoes, all of that big, slow stuff, has much more rapid processes, like the millisecond or nanosecond metabolism of mitochondria in every cell in your body, all participating in a dance of influencing how quickly the carbon moves through the planet to help keep carbon dioxide levels in a range conducive to life on Earth. In particular, that water occurs in all three of its phases. So this amazing process of regeneration is what allows all living things to flourish. Interestingly, our challenge in walking through that Postdoom door is that we lack the inner psychological and external social supports to have regenerative capacity to nurture us through the pain of walking through that door. In this individualistic society, we think we have to walk through it alone. We don't. We actually all will walk through it together. Some of us just won't know that we're walking through, and they'll have their hands over their ears and their eyes closed going, la la la, I don't hear you. So, as we have this discussion tonight, what I want us to really be able to pull out is what are the elements of regeneration that exist in our cultures, that exist in our evolved capacities as human beings, and that exist at this place in the Earth's history as a living planet, for us to participate in the continual regeneration of the biosphere, in whatever forms it's going to take into the future.
So I want to begin to open it up here, but let me just say one more thing, which is related to what are the things that reality, those of you that weren't here this morning, I use the word God and reality interchangeably. So for me, God is a mythic name or an I-thou name for reality. And what reality is telling us through evidence is really vital to know, because there's a lot in history, there's a lot in science, there's a lot in cross-cultural studies that lets us know how to survive and thrive in difficult times. Even if the difficult times are so difficult that we end up dying. So this is the challenge is, we're living in a time of uncertainty. We don't know whether our species will exist 100 years from now. There's probably a decent chance that we will, but there's definitely a decent chance that we won't. We just don't know. So how to live with that uncertainty and how to live with the uncertainty of things a lot sooner than that. For example, Jem Bendell wrote a paper called Deep Adaptation. Jem Bendell is a professional sustainability expert. And he had been working for years with governments and nonprofits and all, and he realized that people were avoiding saying what was so, which is that we know a lot about how previous civilizations have collapsed, and we're classically in that pattern. And so his paper, which is normally academic papers are read by a few dozen people, 500,000 or more, it's probably close to 750,000 people now have read his paper called Deep Adaptation. And it was written so that the general public could understand it. And what he says, to my mind, in a compelling way, is that collapse, societal collapse, is inevitable. It's likely to be catastrophic. And extinction can't be ruled out. Extinction is possible. And that what he said was we professionals, we sustainability professionals, who are using the word sustainable in much of the way that you criticize, need to be among those at the forefront of being able to say the truth, which is that unsustainable civilizations at some point aren't sustained. And we are wildly unsustainable. Said another way, unsustainable civilizations self-destruct. And we are very much in that pattern. So the sooner we can be honest with that, and that we're not going to make an easy transition to some global, industrial, sustainable culture, the better, because that will allow us to break free of some of the damaging habits that we're doing in terms of the soil, the forest, the water, the life upon which our grandchildren, should they be graced to be alive 80, 100 years from now, will require. So the sooner we get real that collapse is inevitable, the sooner we'll make the right choices. It's likely to be really, really difficult. Yes, there'll be great stuff, but let's not sugarcoat that it's going to be really, really difficult. That's likely. And the sooner we can be at peace with our mortality as a species, not just as individuals, but even collectively, the sooner that we will be fearless. Because when I went through cancer treatment 10 years ago this week, I went through cancer treatment. We were at Whidbey Island. I was going in every other week to the Seattle Cancer Care Alliance. There was a period where I had a tumor the size of my fist in my spleen. And there was a period of about a month and a half where we thought I could die the next 8 months. Fortunately, the chemo worked, and it worked really well. But I gained that peace that religious people call the peace that passes understanding, and it wasn't because I was holding out hope for pearly gates. I just really trust life. I trust evolution. I trust ecology. And so I invite all of us to gain that level of fearlessness that comes when you fully accept mortality, when you fully accept that death is inevitable, individually and collectively, like I shared during the sermon this morning. Whether our species lasts another 50 years or another 5 million years, it's most likely going to be in that range. Because no mammal our size lasts more than 5 to 7 million years before an asteroid or supervolcano or something takes it out. So the sooner we can be at peace with our inevitable extinction, whether that's soon or long, and put our faith, our trust in the process, in evolution, in Gaia, in God, not God as an otherworldly being, but God as reality with a personality, trusting that, then we can be engaged in fearless activism, fearless action. Because we're engaged fully from the place of compassion and generosity, making the biggest difference we can in whatever our spheres.
So I can tell that we are both agreed that part of our program will be to have, I wouldn't even say Q&A, but really a discourse with all of you. And that we don't want to just stand up here kind of preaching and ministering to you with our ideas. We really want to have a dialogue. But one thing I'd like to do to get that going is to share with you some of the challenges we've faced and how people have tried to address this crisis as they've come to be aware of it. One thing that I've learned from working in politics, doing political communications, strategic framing work with progressive organizations and grassroots movements, activist groups, is that gradually I came to realize that the root source of political engagement was trauma. I kept watching unhealthy people and unhealthy relationships with a very serious problem with coercion, a history of being abused, mistreated, or neglected, participating in an inhumane system that is inherently life-destroying, and then trying to find pathological behaviors to address pathological systems. I didn't discover this right away. It's that I started studying cognitive science, went to work with George Lakoff, learned strategic framing, started advising groups, gradually came to see that what I was doing was a lot like cognitive behavioral therapy. When I was working with an organization on the discourse that they participated in, I was showing them ways to find cultural healing in a discourse that revealed their pain and trauma. What is climate activism? It's a healthy response to an unhealthy relationship with the rest of life. When I learned this, I saw that most of our actions in response were actually things resolvable by cognitive behavioral therapy, which is basically you live in a story that gives you a sense of how the world is, except that story is wrong. The mechanisms of the story tell you to behave in a certain way that don't deal with the root causes, reproduce the conditions of the problem, and then you reproduce the same actions in a continual cycle until you step back and assess, usually with some outside support. Someone helps you see your story. And as you see your story, you start to see that there are things that are little unconscious biases and judgments, and you start to change your story until your story matches how things actually are. So you're like, oh, the life sucks, I can't make friends, everyone's so mean. Oh wait, it could be because I'm behaving like an asshole. And what's interesting is, as you start to change your story, you change your behavior, you change who you talk to, you change what you talk about, and you begin to live into a different story. What's interesting about this time in history is how much knowledge has been accumulated and validated just in the last 40 years about how to grow a healthy human being across their lifespan, how community health and resilience actually work, the adaptations that are fit for a cultural system to its ecological setting. Mostly that's the study of indigenous communities, and to some extent, alternative models that have recently been attempted. For example, co-housing has been thoroughly documented how it works at building communities. So there are these different ways that we have learned how all of this works. And if we keep participating in the pathological stories, we never get around to the regenerative work. And the regenerative work is living into stories based on the world as it is. Finding and recognizing what is sacred in ourselves and giving life to it. And by the way, many of the root causes of our ecological crisis come from the human relationship to the surrounding landscape and the drawing of resources into human bodies, growing our populations, at the expense of all the complexity of life and the rest of the ecosystems around us. The most direct and blatant version of that today is industrial agriculture, which is responsible for somewhere between 70 and 80% of the planetary overshoot, as measured by the Planetary Boundaries Framework of the Stockholm Resilience Center. Land system change, biodiversity loss, the cycling of nitrogen and phosphorus, and climate change, all in a vicious cycle of amplification, from deforestation, from erosion and runoff, from pouring chemicals to kill things, to only grow the one crop we care about. All of that system tells us a story about ourselves that probably none of us would like if we really listen to what that story says. I destroy more and more so as to cling to the increasingly dead land as I kill it, so that more people like me may live. So, we love to begin a dialogue about what we can do as individuals, as communities, as regions, as the earth, aware of the earth, as nature designing as nature. How can we human beings create the conditions conducive to life? And how can we live into stories that fill us with it so that we can put it into our surroundings? Or how do we put it into our surroundings so that we can feed it to ourselves and not have poisons in our bodies? Goes in both directions. So we'd love to have a conversation that begins to flow, and Michael and I, we both could talk all night, we probably could gather this, and we're happy to keep sharing things if it's requested. But we also know that this is not a time for grandstanding, egotism, or false leaders. This is a no-guru zone. Because what we're dealing with is so damn complex that no one knows how to solve it. So this is our time to practice the kinds of conversations that can enable us to find our way into regeneration.
Every indigenous, pro-future, stable, sustainable society or culture that I've read about has had a pretty clear line between what is good and what is evil. What is to be encouraged, supported, celebrated, and what is to be discouraged, frowned upon, or even ostracizing, or at times death. And it's quite simply, are these behaviors, are these actions, are these attitudes, are the things that we're doing individually, collectively, a blessing or a curse to the future? The distinction between pro-future and anti-future is not the only demarcation of good and evil, but it's fundamental in every sustainable culture. The challenge is, in unsustainable cultures, they tend to be human-centered, not life-centered. And so eco-centric cultures tend to the well-being of everything that culture depends upon as a sacred responsibility, as a sacred obligation. Nothing is more holy than ensuring that the food that supplies you stays healthy, that the water that supplies you stays healthy, that supplies us, that every aspect of life that's provided by the grace of life, I'll use non-religious words for now, just the grace of life, that though the well-being of the systems that we depend upon are more important than us. That's the definition of sacred. It's something that's more important than you, more important than us. It can't be bought or sold. Anything that can enter the market economy becomes desacralized. That's why there's never in the history of humanity been a market-based economy that didn't self-destruct. Ever. Because once you start measuring good, and to be encouraged based on monetary considerations and how well it influences or benefits individuals and groups of individuals, you're already on the path to perdition. You're already on the path to, you're on the path to hell. You're basically going to create hell for your grandchildren or great-grandchildren. It's just going to take time. So good and evil, at the very least, whatever else it means, it has to be defined in terms of pro-future or anti-future. Good is that which encourages us to live, to vote, to sacrifice, to do everything we can to try to be a blessing to the future. That's not easy when we're in unsustainable cultures, when we are in anti-future cultures that have been such for hundreds or in some cases thousands of years. It's not easy. This is not a time for purity. So I think that good and evil has to be discerned. I mean, let me say one last thing on it, which is we have an economic system, and I'm going to use a very religiously loaded term that you never, ever hear in Unitarian churches. We have an economic system that is demonic. Now, what do I mean by that? I'm not meaning demons or spirits. Good and evil, as I said, always have been in every healthy culture. Good and evil have always been discerned in large part by how we impact others and how that ripples out in the future. So if I don't do something kind or generous or loving or in some way that's clearly helpful to the future, I've done a good thing. If I do something that's harmful to others or harmful to the future, I've done a bad thing. If I sacrifice to be a blessing to others in the future, I've done a great thing or a heroic thing. But if I serve my own needs, if I'm an individual or a corporation and I'm getting wealthy, screw others. To hell with the future. I've done an evil thing. This is not moral rocket science. And any system, any economic or political system that makes it easy or inevitable for millions of normal people to do evil, if that system doesn't deserve the name demonic, nothing is worthy of that language anymore. Let's just toss it all in the trash can. We have an economic system where it's possible, think nesting dolls, that's the nature of reality, nested reality. Subatomic particles within atoms, within molecules, within cells, and so on. That's the nature of reality, that science, that evidence has given us. We're in the middle. We're made up of smaller creative realities like our microbiome that we can't exist without, and we are dependent upon larger creative realities like the trees and the other aspects of the biosphere and the other plants and animals. So we are dependent on multiple levels, yet we're in the middle. So imagine nesting dolls, and one of the middle level starts exploiting the rest of the body for its own benefit. This is crazy. And yet we have an economic system where it's possible and it's profitable for a subset of the whole to benefit at the expense of the whole. Individuals and corporations can get mega wealthy in ways that are harmful to the community or to the future. Whether you call this evil or unsustainable or just insane, it doesn't matter. It doesn't have a future. So that was a long-winded question, but good and evil have to be discerned by how we impact the larger community of life, not just the human community, and the future.
So my daughter turns 3 years old in January. The only reason she's not here is because if she was here, she would say, "Daddy, stop talking, grab the microphone, and make me go play with her over there on the floor." And I would do it. I actually think this is an essential question because when I think about what happened to my wife Jessica and I when we decided, eyes wide open, we know what's going on in the world, we decided to have a child. We had been married for more than 10 years, we had waited, we thought about it, and what we decided, and it wasn't even conscious, because when our daughter was born, I experienced this mix, this paradoxical blend of absolute sheer joy and love, because I'm so happy to be a father. And at the same time, I plummeted into a suicide-like depression. I say suicide-like because I wasn't going to kill myself, but I wanted to. As I grappled with my responsibility for bringing new life into the world, new life that would deal with things I saw coming. When I came to realize, as I grappled with the intensity of that polarity, it was actually quite a simple thing. I had put skin in the game that I was betting on humans being worthy to be a good and healing part of this planet. Always in my heart, I had felt that human beings were something beautiful and wonderful, and I had seen some bad things and a rough childhood. but I had seen how beautiful human beings can be, and I'd studied the evolution of our species, I'd studied cultural evolution, had a sense of what we're capable of, our godlike powers, and I felt like we were net positive for the planet. And this is partly because I had given up on trying to take action to stop the ecological collapse. And so what I've come to now is a journey that will probably not end until I pass away and until my wife passes away, of how do we be parents in this kind of time. And one thing we've learned is that our daughters better get a hell of a lot of immersion in intact ecosystems. So we spent the last year living in Costa Rica in a biodiversity hotspot with 650 bird species, thousands of insects. We had the deadliest spider in the world in our house 4 times. I had to kill it. One time it was in our daughter's little bag of toys. She's like, "Mama, there's a spider." It's like, "Oh shit, that's the Brazilian wandering spider." We did that because we wanted her to know what an intact ecosystem looks like. Because when we were living in Eugene, Oregon, where we were before we moved, there wasn't an intact ecosystem to be found. There aren't any left in North America, except for tiny pockets by roadsides or in abandoned rails to trails or something. We've destroyed almost all of it before all of us were born, over 100 years ago. Just read the accounts of baskets dipped in all the rivers pulling out salmon, or walking into the bay in Boston, they're in the water and having to dodge all the porpoises. The hours and hours of the passenger pigeons flying overhead, darkening the sky like clouds. All of that happened decades before I was born, 100 years before I was born. So we had to go there. We also learned that we have to find and have a dignified relationship with an indigenous community so that our daughter can get a spiritual education from people who actually know what the hell they're doing. And so we're looking for that now. My family is intentionally homeless at the moment as we're on a journey to find this way of raising our daughter. And we're not doing it for our daughter, we're doing it because we know a lot of people trying to answer this question. So I think this is an extremely important question, and it relates to whether or not we feel like we're the battered wife that should just stay in the abusive relationship, if we're actually worth something and we should get to work fixing ourselves. Our daughter answered that for us.
Wow, that was great. This has become fresh for me in a new way because 2 weeks ago today, actually 2 weeks ago today, we learned that our youngest daughter is pregnant. She's 29 years old, and I had been terrified of this, and I'm now at peace. And by at peace, all I mean is I accept life, and I accept that this child is going to have a really, really challenging life. But children don't compare it to the past. Reality is just what it is for them. They just accept reality on its terms. If they're born in a war zone, that's just what it is. They're born whatever. And so I can't think of a holier responsibility than being as loving and as generous and as kind and as supportive as I can be to my granddaughter and to other kids, and to stand with young people. To stand with young people now, Greta and just the Sunrise Movement and all this, the awakening of young people as their stand for intergenerational justice. And many of them, they get that our species we may have decades left. They know that. And yet it's the moral, just, right, loving, generous, compassionate thing to do everything they possibly can. And this is the paradox that I've discovered in this Postdoom conversation series, is that the reason that most of us avoid going even to the doom door is because we're afraid we're going to spend the rest of our life in paralyzed despair. And the interesting paradox that I was not prepared for is that almost without exception, when somebody goes through, and I'm learning this because I've already had about 40 of these post-Doom conversations with these amazing world leaders on this. When somebody goes through, they often, as they open up to the spheres of gratitude, and we are so fortunate, they find paradoxically their activism more engaged. but it's now coming from a place of fearless love rather than fear. And activism based on fear and terror, because if we don't get this person elected, if we don't stop this pipeline, if we don't do this, then, and then there's this big sort of ... whatever terrifying thing, which is all accurate most likely, from the place of accepting that I'm going to die, we're eventually going to die, that could happen in the not too distant future, and I'm going to invest every ounce of my energy into standing with young people for intergenerational justice, and loving young people, and doing what I can to confront injustice, and the systems that are often, it's not that evil people are running these, it's just that these systems have been at work for so long that there's such inertia that we can't change systems. It's like trying that old, thing, trying to turn an ocean liner quickly. You don't do it, it doesn't happen that way. So we can be engaged as activists, but again, when we have a heart of regeneration and we trust the regenerative process of life, I suspect you will find your activism being more engaged from a place of fearlessness. Just one example. When you understand how civilizations and empires, great civilizations and empires have collapsed and contracted, and all you got to do is Google sane versus insane progress. I have a short 24-minute video that goes into this. It's on YouTube, sane versus insane progress. But once you understand this pattern, then you realize that the political insanity tends to unwind in very predictable ways in empire after empire. And the economic system becomes insane and self-destroys in very predictable ways. And so when you understand that, then when something like the last election happened, instead of going, oh no, this shouldn't be, you say, oh, right on schedule.
Yeah.
And then you're more engaged than ever because it's not from the place of just bitterness, it's from the place of engaged action to make the biggest difference politically and economically and locally that you possibly can.